text come up on that. So you can suddenly be like, oh my god.
Like it's an emergency.
Oh my god, my child got a head injury. Yeah.
Or it's lunch and she's thinking.
I see. Right. Whereas if you just saw that there was a text from school, you'd be like, your mind would go to the worst possible scenario.
It's like call. Oh my god, what's happening? Where's the peanut butter? Are you
That's right.
Oh, we're live.
It's 3:59. I tweeted it. Martha Jones retweeted it. You know, we're business. Do you see that me and A got the band call? Yeah, it's a great one. Did you meet her? Were you do know her? She was here in the fall.
She was at Rutgers when I was there. A while ago. Okay.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here for our panel. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the Director for Academic Affairs here at UVA and in the History Department. And we're delighted to have Vanessa Holden and Justene Hill Edwards, also from UVA, here today for this conversation. I'm just going to do a few little introductory remarks, and then we'll ask questions and engage in conversation. So we want to welcome everyone on behalf of Virginia Humanities, which is the producer of the Virginia Festival of the Book. Ask everyone to silence your cell phones. But also, if you'd like to tweet with the hashtag VABookFest or hashtag VABook2022. Kevin, I'm sure you're going to be tweeting during the event.
Don't bet on it.
The co-sponsor of today's event is the Corcoran Department of History here at UVA, and we want to thank them. The festival is free of charge, but it is not free of cost. So while admission is free, we encourage you to support the festival through donations, which you can do at vabook.org. There are also evaluations that you can do online about the programming. If you'd like to make suggestions, you can complete one online at vabook.org/feedback, or there's a QR code in the programs that you can just click on to get that evaluation. And finally, for COVID precautions, as you're well aware, we're asking the audience to keep masks on during the event. And we've done tests up here so that we can talk more freely. Finally, as you'll see, there are books available for sale, including the two wonderful books we're talking about today, so we encourage you to support the authors with a book purchase after the event. I'm going to introduce our two panelists, and then we'll launch into the discussion. First one is Justene Hill Edwards, over here on our left. Who's the author of Unfree Markets, an assistant professor here in the Corcoran Department of History at UVA, so close to home. And Vanessa Holden has traveled here. We appreciate you coming. Author of Surviving Southampton, African American Women in Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. And she's an assistant professor of history at the University of Kentucky. Her writing has been published in Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Black Perspectives, Perspectives on History, Process, and the Rumpus. So we're really grateful that you could take the time to talk about these amazing books. I hope maybe some of you have read them. If not, I strongly urge you to do so. It was a great experience for me to delve into them. And both of these books are really about telling new stories that haven't really been told, both in terms of African American history and aspects of African American history, but really more broadly just the history of this country and pieces of that history that have been overlooked, I think, in fundamental ways. So I wanted to ask you both to start by telling us how you kind of came to these projects and how you came to understand that these stories were things that hadn't been told, that needed to be told, and kind of could reframe our understanding of history. So, either one of you want to start?
I can go first since I'm closest to the mic. So I did my undergraduate work just down the road from Charlottesville at what was then Randolph-Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, Virginia. And while there, I took a number of history courses as a history major, but it was the first time I ever read the published Confessions of Nat Turner, a primary document that historians of slavery broadly and honestly undergraduates engage with all the time. It's a very popular source to have students look at. And while it is a heavily mediated source, glimpses of Turner's own experience, his own voice, and his own real drive for a particular kind of freedom making through violent revolt do shine through. And one piece of his story that I zeroed in on even as an undergraduate really was the portion of the Confessions that focus on his time as a fugitive from slavery after the rebellion. He remained a fugitive for a little over 2 months post-rebellion. And while there was a lot of speculation in the press about where he could possibly be this great rebel leader, it turns out he actually was hiding out in dugout caves pretty close to the place where he was enslaved. And I believe, not coincidentally, pretty close to the place where his wife was enslaved. So as an undergraduate, I began with the question, who was feeding Nat Turner? He couldn't grow his own food, he couldn't hunt for his own food, and while he a couple of times stole his own food, that became impossible fairly quickly because he was so recognizable and wanted. And that really basic, broad research question led me down the pathway of asking where were women in this community. And even now, over a decade after first beginning what became this project, I don't have a single individual's name to give you. But I do have a community of women and children and free people of color and other enslaved men who are much more visible to me because I asked a question about community and resistance in community. And that question continued to follow me into the publication of this book. And for those of you who are out there in the Twitterverse, this past August, which marked the 190th anniversary of the Southampton Rebellion, I tweeted basically every day from August 21st through the end of October and into November when Nat Turner was executed, marking time and using that digital space as a way to mark the amount of time he spent as a fugitive, almost certainly being supported by his community. You can find that at the hashtag, one word, hashtag surviving Southampton, and I'm at Dr. V. Holden.
Well, I started thinking about the topic that would become the book project years ago. In some ways, I've always been interested in history of money. But I never thought that my interest in money and in wealth would converge with the history of slavery. And so that's kind of where my interest in this topic came from. I was doing a master's degree in African diaspora studies and taking a class on slavery in the British Atlantic world, and we were reading really interesting books about slavery in the Caribbean, slavery in the American South, and we read a few books about the role of market women, specifically enslaved women who were responsible for selling goods in marketplaces. And I honed in on Bridgetown, Barbados, and Charleston, South Carolina. And these two places really captured my attention because I was just astounded by the fact that enslaved women could wield so much power visibly in these really important marketplaces. I ended up focusing on South Carolina for a particular set of reasons. As a historian of American slavery, South Carolina looms quite largely in this history, especially enslavers and politicians really being in the vanguard of pro-slavery thought, especially in the 19th century. And so South Carolina really kind of lured me and captured my attention for a very long time. But as I started to think about the research questions and really get into the archival record, I started to realize that, yes, while it was important that the enslaved, especially enslaved women, would occupy visible places in kind of port cities, but in kind of slaveholding colonies in states writ large, I started to ask another question. Could they use the kind of visible economic power that they seemingly had at times and use that for what they really wanted, which was freedom? And it wasn't until I started looking into the history of capitalism, this was around the time when the kind of convergence of slavery and capitalism among historians was on the crescendo. And so I started to wonder, could the enslaved actually begin to transform and use the economic power that they were cultivating through buying goods, through trading and selling goods, to buy what they really wanted, which was their freedom? And through looking at a variety of sources, I found that that answer was no. There were so few instances in which an enslaved man or woman, especially in South Carolina, could transform their independent economic activity into freedom. But that led me to ask, again, a different set of questions about not just the economy and culture of slavery, but how the culture of capitalism influenced the economic decisions of the enslaved. And so that is how I started to think about the book and conceptualize this larger question about the slaves' economy and the rise of capitalism.
I can just ask a follow-up on that. In some ways, I mean, what connects both your books, or one of the things that connects your books, is partly a reframing of women's roles, right? And in this economic sense, or as producers, as kind of the just kind of changing our sense. And again, it's something that other scholars have worked on as well. But it's a little bit like remapping our imaginary around how we think of the daily worlds of slavery. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that. What was, because you talk in your book about it being kind of intimate rebellion, right? And then you kind of explore all these other zones of family, of intimacy, of kinship that were inherently around this story, which is so often told, right, as a story focusing on violence and male participation. And in your case, right, all of the kind of complexities of an economy, which is also about family, community, and doesn't translate in certain ways into that kind of larger political aspiration. But are there ways, I mean, I think both of you are reaching towards asking us to think just differently about slavery, and maybe making the very way that we think about what this was kind of different. I wonder if that could spur some thoughts on either of you.
Sure. Do you want to go first? First, last one? Oh, you want me to go? Sure. Oh. Okay. So one thing that I had to do a lot in my work was use space and place as a source, and think about geography in a couple different dimensions, but I'll stick with sort of physical geography. So in one way that I had to really envision slavery in Southampton County in the 1830s was to not just sort of hover over the county looking at maps, but to really think about moving through space, and to think about the various kinds of negotiations that can happen in intimate space. And Black women's historians and historians of Black women in slavery have talked about these sort of intimate spaces time and again, thinking through households, thinking through sites of labor and sites of skilled labor. But I found a lot of the people in the county, the white landowners for the most part, didn't own large land holdings. There are a few people who did, but most did not. And often they're working in very close proximity to enslaved people throughout the day. And so really, zoning in not just on moving through the county along the rebellion route, but moving through individual farms, and thinking about women's space and women's spaces and sites of feminized labor really helped me assert that, well, we're just sort of thinking of enslaved men as the more mobile gender, which is true in a sense, because they had access sometimes to skilled trades. That wasn't really possible in Southampton, but it was possible in a lot of places. Enslaved women were actually the more mobile gender within a household, that there were reasons and sites of labor for women that would require them to be just about anywhere on a farm or plantation during the work day. That just was not the case for men. So it gave them access to intelligence, it gave them access to communication, it gave them access to information. of the kind of information that would be super valuable if you're planning to go from farm to farm and murder a bunch of people when they least expect it. And so for me, the kind of sort of deep reflection on space and place brought a new understanding of enslaved women's daily lives.
You know, Vanessa, I think you make up a good point about the idea of really pushing the boundaries of what we think about the daily lives of the enslaved, right? And what they did, how they navigated space and community and family and friendships. And in my work, one of the ideas that I was thinking about quite a bit was trying to understand what the enslaved thought about money and wages. And thinking about how, or if they were connecting wages and money to freedom. Because I think oftentimes, especially in American society and Western culture, we often believe that money and wealth equals more political freedom, right? But on a small scale, especially at the ground level, if we look at the experiences of enslaved men and women, then we see something a little bit different. The enslaved men and women that I look at in the book are spending their free time fishing, making baskets, selling goods, making pastries, trading whatever they could get their hands on, oftentimes just to be able to purchase goods that they wanted or needed. I'm talking about hats or shoes or a ticket to purchase a loved one at a neighboring plantation. Or they were using these opportunities to make money and earn wages, to kind of leave the confines of the plantation to form communities outside of the ones in which they were primarily living and working in. And so if anything, I'm hoping that in my work I encourage readers, historians, and scholars to think more critically about how tightly we connect ideas of money and wages, and perhaps even the benefits of American capitalism, to ideas of freedom, and kind of complicating that, what I think of as a cozy relationship, and making it a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really enjoyed about your work is the ways that you kind of challenge assumptions about freedom. And particularly like American versions of freedom that are often tied to success in the capitalist system. Success often very narrowly defined, but success nonetheless. And I find a lot, when I present on the work, most people have heard of Nat Turner's Rebellion, or they've heard of Southampton County, Virginia, and there's an assumption about rebellion and the goals of revolt, and that the goal is freedom, and that there's one definition for that. And by expanding my view to children's experiences, to free women of color's experience, people who already are legally free, their definitions of freedom don't always line up with our assumptions about what freedom is. And their actions during the rebellion don't line up in this neat binary of for the rebellion or against it. You're not gonna find a lot of cut and dry, down for the cause rebels versus people who were in collusion. That it's not that simple when your day-to-day existence and survival depends on really playing like 14-dimensional chess. With a deep knowledge of the white people who have, like a very deep knowledge of their daily habits and their wants and their whims, that you don't really get that neat, clean, here are the people who are for, here are the people who are against, and that's it. You actually get a story that's like heavily mediated by people who are invested in making this as small a rebellion as possible, and making sure that it's over. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking a lot, obviously, about Caribbean connections. I know both of you have engaged with the literature on the Caribbean too, but some of it is that, as this story, stretches, of course, into after slavery, right, and just kind of a broad history in some ways about how African American communities kind of constituted themselves, the value system And in the Caribbean context, there's a kind of somewhat of a clearer historiography about people kind of taking land, right, and transforming ultimately after slavery, money into maybe land ownership, which then allows for certain kinds of community formation, right? Or you can think about also churches or religious things, spaces, or but also other ways of occupying space, right? Clothing, dress, the performance sphere, all these sorts of ways that. And it feels to me there's a lot of parallels. There's a lot of parallels in facts between the U.S. and the Caribbean that are less present in our literatures than we might think. And I felt like these books actually bring some of that more closer together, just because what you're paying attention to. But I wonder if there is a way in which, in terms of the takeaways, right, of the long-term history, maybe African American history or broader U.S. history, are there things that, like, from this story, you see heading forward into the present? I know that's a big question, but.
No, I think that's a great question, and one of the kind of lasting influences that will stay with me from writing and finishing the book is thinking critically about the longer history of economic inequality, and in particular the racial wealth gap. I think it is difficult, if not impossible, to fully understand and appreciate and comprehend the ways in which the vestiges of slavery, the legal vestiges of slavery, remained a visible part of American society long after slavery's illegal end in 1865. And so there is, again, a direct connection that we can make between the lack of capital, the lack of economic opportunities that African Americans had once legal emancipation was ratified, and the ways in which we continue to see, especially in our public policy discourse, about the widening racial wealth gap, and there are direct connections there. And so gaining a fuller appreciation of the ways in which slavery continued to influence the ways in which African Americans could exist and thrive in the U.S., I think is an incredibly important kind of takeaway that I'm continuing to think about as I launch new research projects.
I think, so something that I often want to highlight when I talk about my work is that I really resist the framing of Black history as this unknown. That, like, nobody knows this history, nobody remembers these people. You've recovered lost voices, or you're giving people love. No. If you go to Southampton County today, Nat Turner's descendants own the land he was once enslaved on. They bought it in the early 20th century. They still some rent pieces of it out, some live on it. There are still people with all of the last names, both Black and white, who live in the county today. Southampton County didn't evaporate in November of 1831 and ceased existing. And most recently, local folks in the county have done a lot of work to commemorate the history in the ways that they want their ancestors to be remembered. Until February of 2021, it was possible to still drive down Blackhead Signpost Road in Southampton County, a site where during the rebellion at least one individual's head was placed on a signpost. And then they named a street after it when the county got 911 service in the 20th century. And through Black activism, they have renamed the street and added a marker so that now Blackhead Signpost and Blackhead Signpost Road are history. They're not a present marker in the county. So when I think about, connections, beyond slavery, I want to highlight the very, deep vernacular curation practices that exist in the county now. That it's not, it's certainly not unknown history. The women that I talk about pop up in people's collective historical memory in the county. Local folks in the county have done a lot of work to preserve this rebellion, and in that way, people continue to survive this rebellion in a very visceral way. Many roads in the county are named after significant sites sites in this rebellion, places where people were murdered, places where people were executed, and that's the Green Street signs. You tell somebody to turn left on Cabin Pond Road, well, that's where Nat Turner decided this rebellion would start, Cabin Pond. You can drive right by it, it's still there. So when I think about survival in the book, I think about a couple of meanings for the word. I think about the meaning that we call people survivors when they endure something, so a natural disaster, tragedy, they're a survivor, they survived. But we also use the word survivor for people who are bereaved. We use that word in obituaries when we talk about the deceased being survived by family, by kin, right? And so both of those meanings are still embedded in the way that locals experience this, but also the kind of reverberations of rebellion. The ways that Nat Turner is almost immediately transformed into an American archetype for the ever lurking rebellious slave. Or is he a protester? Or is he a Black Power advocate? Or is he, right? There's always this kind of that ever menacing character or caricature of a historical person is present in American culture. So there's a way that we're all surviving this, and whether or not, given certain contexts, we're willing to admit that it's still slavery, that this still comes back to slavery is another question, I think. But I really want to push this remembering of survival as something that is continuous and continues.
Thank you. I recently visited, and many people have too, the Harriet Tubman sort of site, the national park. And what's so remarkable there, right, is that they're trying to figure out how you kind of have a monument that's the landscape itself, right? And people, it's really about moving across the landscape. It's not a figuration or one place, and it's so interesting in terms of, you know, how the historical memory of some of the stories you're telling obviously has to take a different shape in a certain way, or a shape that it. I'm wondering if I can ask you if there's kind of moments, either kind of archival finds or particular figures whose stories, when you discovered them, helped you kind of crystallize the bigger story, right? I think that often happens when you're writing, that something really clicks, or there's a particularly compelling encounter. If there's anything like that from your process that you could share.
The first person that immediately comes to mind is an enslaved woman that I talk about in the introduction to the book. Her name was Venus, and one of the reasons why I focus on her is because she kind of popped up as I was doing research a few times. And so as a historian, if you are looking through records and you see the name of one person a few times, then it's particularly poignant. And so Venus was a young enslaved woman who lived in Charleston in the 1750s. And the first time that she pops up in the historical record, she pops up as a runaway. Her enslaver named John Bruce, he posts an ad in the South Carolina Gazette saying, if anyone finds my slave. She was a girl, I'm thinking maybe 10 or 11 or 12. And he is kind of begging white Charlestonians that if they find her, please bring her to the workhouse, and he would retrieve her there. And so he does. And then the following year, in 1756, she runs away again. And he posts another ad saying, please bring my slave girl to the workhouse. She subsequently runs away again 2 years later, but this time she is gone for about 7 years. And so in this time, she goes by the name Free Mary and Free Hannah. And she has 3 children, and she works as a washerwoman, and she works in the lower marketplace of Charleston, where enslaved market women would kind of bring goods and buy and sell goods. And so the final time that she pops up in the historical record is in the 1760s when her enslaver, John Bruce, dies. and he's basically looking for her for all of these years. And he dies, and so the executor of his estate wants to include her and her children in the kind of reckoning of his property. And that is the last time that she is in the historical record, but there's just so many kind of interesting tidbits. One, that she was a young enslaved girl, and she consistently runs away. Her enslaver is consistently putting advertisements in the local newspaper trying to find her. They kind of gather all this information about the fact that she is claiming to be a free woman, and to provide for herself and her family, she goes by the name Free Mary, Free Hannah, and she's essentially working for wages. And so since kind of that is the last time that she pops up in the historical record in the 1760s, I have all of these questions about who she was, kind of what her struggle was, but ultimately what she presumably wanted, which was freedom. And so she was kind of using this kind of guise of being a free woman to protect herself, to protect her family. And what I don't think happened is that I don't think that she got her freedom. Perhaps she did at the outbreak of the American Revolution, I'm not sure. But when I read her kind of stories of her life, or read the slave ads, it brought all of these questions in my mind about her ability to perhaps earn enough to buy the freedom for herself and her family, and I don't think that was her reality.
So one of the things that my research required me to do was look at a lot of very well-read sources. I wish I could say like I found some secret, brand new diary or something that told me all I needed to know about women in this rebellion, but I didn't. I looked at all the sources that other people have looked at. The trial records for this rebellion have actually been in a printed collection for a very long time. It's easy to get a hold of actually here you can easily get a hold of the microfilm. There's some collections right here in special collections that you can access, photos of the county from 1900 and so on. But one thing I had to do, so I said I thought about geography in a couple different ways. I didn't think about the geography of my sources themselves. So I've looked at the published collection of trial records. I've also looked at the microfilm of the originals. And then I've been to Southampton County, and I've actually looked at the physical minute books where all these trials are held. And minute books, for those of you who aren't familiar, are really, huge books. They're, about as tall as this table, and they're wide. And they're a book in which a clerk would write out everything that happened in court on a given date to record it. There were no court stenographers in the 19th century, so it was all by hand, so you have to hope as a historian that they have good handwriting and they didn't just get the job because their dad had it, But I'm lucky the county clerk in Southampton had good handwriting. So if you only pay attention to the disaggregated trial, right, you get one piece of what happens on a given day during these trials. But if you read the whole court day, you learn about all sorts of other people who floated in and out of that courtroom and the courtyard on a given day. And so often it takes, from the point in a book page where the court date starts to the first trial, you have to flip the page once or twice. There's all sorts of people who were there on a given date. And one thing that I began to see repeatedly when I zoomed out and really looked at the geography of the minute book were free people of color. They were arriving in the midst of these trials, usually in groups, meaning they had to walk through a courtyard that was full of white people who wanted to make sure whatever happened in these courtrooms was what they considered to be justice. They had to walk, if they could probably see the hanging tree from where they were moving into the space. They had to walk past the jail. Right? So again, moving through geography to get to the courtroom, to get their names recorded as free people who were residents of this county. It was required by Virginia law that they do it once a year, but in the wake of this rebellion, it was a particularly important time to make sure that your name and your description and your identification that you were a free person was in an official document. So often juxtaposed on a page, you'll have a trial here, and right next to that trial are Black people asserting their freedom and getting their freedom recorded. And so working in these sources, right, and thinking about the ways that Black people are creating freedom in the physical documents that are meant to be the ultimate testimony to white hegemonic power, it's really powerful that these people are going to venture into what is certainly a dangerous situation to make sure. There are people who are getting free papers redrawn up because they lost their original ones, and they're like, no, you're going to give me my free papers now before you go on to these trials for the day, right? It's huge, and it reshapes the ways that people are using these structures. You know, think about what you do with capitalism, that at the same time that the people you're studying are the capital, right? You know, that it's not that them participating suddenly like overturns slavery, right? But they're eking out, right, these little glimpses of freedom, right? And that these people were able to record a definition in an official source is something that's never really talked about in the context of the rebellion, right? Focus is never on them. And I sort of chuckle because that's kind of by design, right? That's how resistance works. Like if the focus had been on them, then they probably would not have fared very well, right? So finding ways to slip in, you know, through these geographies are real important to come out on the other end on your way to Liberia, or you know, come out on the other end going to Petersburg, getting out of the county, something like that, right? Is an important piece of what is happening around survival.
Can you talk a little bit about the beautiful painting on the front of your on the front of your book? I've been just enthralled by it since the book came out, and I'm sure I'd love to hear about how that came to be.
Yeah. I'm always happy to talk about Stephen Towns and his artwork, the artwork that's featured on the cover of my book. And Stephen Towns is a Baltimore-based artist, and I have a little anecdote. It's very like chicken soup for the historian's soul. I was in Baltimore to present at a conference around Black marriage, and I was commenting on Tara Hunter's work on African American marriage in the antebellum period, in the era of emancipation. And we had a little bit of free time, and so I saw that there were these amazing story quilts on display at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the story they were telling was the story of the Southampton Rebellion. And I thought, well, if I've got a few minutes, I gotta go. And Tara Hunter was like, oh, can I come along? And I was like, yes, absolutely, Tara Hunter, you can come along. And so we went to the museum, and we saw the quilts, and it was really beautiful, and I was like, wow, I wish I could have something like that on the cover of my book. And later that evening when we were presenting, there was a man in the front row, and he was taking all these notes, and I was like, wow, this community member is really into Black marriage and the Civil War. This is intense. And he came up to me afterwards and said, oh, you know, I've been in the county too, and, you know, I did these, I'm an artist, I've done some quilts. And I was like, I said, oh my God, you're Stephen Towns. And so we all took a picture with him. I think he was a little overwhelmed by this, but we all got to take a picture with him, and he signed my, you know, program from his exhibition. And we stayed in touch. And when it came time to work with University of Illinois Press on the cover, I asked for this story quilt to be a part of it. And unfortunately, in 2 dimensions, the quilt does not read. You can't really see the various fabrics he uses. You don't really get a sense for why it's so striking as a piece of artwork. But he did a whole series of paintings called the Black Magic series. He plays on magic, but he also plays with religious motifs. He plays with iconography. So the halo is probably the most recognizable version of that. But of course, icons, what they're holding and where they are in an icon is very important. It tells the saint's story. And this story is the story of Nat and Sherry Turner. Sherry Turner is his wife. We mostly know that she existed. And this is an image of her as Stephen imagines her. And she's holding an infant, and she's also holding broken shackles. And behind her is you can't really see probably from where you're all sitting, but behind her is the community and cotton fields. A pretty unique crop to Southampton County, Virginia. Don't get a lot of cotton in Virginia. And so the art team said, but what about this painting? And I said, well, we'll have to ask him if that's possible. And I'm so happy he said yes, because his work, there are a lot of images of Nat Turner floating around. There's a pretty famous one that was in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel of him sort of menacing in a swamp, and there are all kinds of images. There's even a children's comic book. I see somebody in the yes. There's a comic book for small children. There's also a beautiful graphic novel. A lot of images of Nat Turner in the world. But Stephen's work is the first work where I felt like an artist was doing with this story what I wanted to do in my historical writing. I wasn't able to find anything more about Cherry than what we already knew. And so for me, this was my nod to her, and my nod to the ways in which clearly her survival practice worked, because we don't know much about her. I talk a lot about trusting silence, and you must deal. You just talked about this in your own recounting of Venus's story, that we confront just blank spaces, and we confront all sorts of things studying enslaved women, and a lot of times folks talk about it as this deficit. They speak of it from like a deficit perspective, and it can be frustrating. I'm not gonna lie, but through looking at these women in Southampton, I learned to really trust when they weren't talking, when they were sort of only answering the questions they were asked and not adding additional information, when they managed to fade into the background and not be included in what white men were thinking of when they thought about rebel, what a rebel should look like, what a murderer should look like. And I had to smile, as I was combing through these sources for them, that they're still evading us. And I've met their descendants in Southampton County. So whose survival worked out? Having this cover is for me is a huge honor. But for me, it's also a nice nod to Cherry Turner, giving her a little visibility, because artists get to imagine things in ways that, as historians, we don't get to do that.
Thanks. That was wonderful. Well, we have some time for questions from you all, if you'd like to ask some. So we get to yes, please go ahead.
This has been amazingly interesting, and it's opened up a lot of questions about Black women. But the one I'm familiar with, of course, locally is Sally Hemmings. She was free, and I always heard that in her afterlife she lived on Main Street and attended the Black Baptist Church. It's there. It says Colored Baptist right above it. And she was there with her children and her grandchildren, and some of them had red hair. Do you know anything about her, or would her name ever come up would somebody write a Black history sign about her? It's local history, but it's also word of mouth history. And since she talked about local history, I mean, I'd love to ask you a lot of questions about that, but that's the story I know about a Black woman. And my big thing is, did any of them learn to read and write? I'm sure they were smart, women, and could negotiate with the white woman of the house, but did any of them even try to learn to read and write? So those are my questions.
So while it remained illegal in most jurisdictions to educate Black people, that doesn't mean that Black people didn't know how to read. It just means it was illegal to formally teach Black people how to read. So we know from enslaved people's narratives that they did all sorts of things to learn to read, and some to write their names or to learn formal writing. So while it certainly would make sense that you don't always run across a lot of individual evidence of people reading, because that's something you would need to keep hidden. I never go into my research assuming that people couldn't read. Now, as far as Sally Hemmings goes, there has been a lot of controversy around the story of the Hemmingses for a very long time because of what it makes people confront and deal with when it comes to the American past. And when not just any American past, but the American past of one of the most well-known founding fathers in American history. But there are a number of works about the Hemmings family, probably most famously Annette Gordon Reed's, but there are a number of works about the Hemmings family. Because it wasn't just Sally Hemmings, she had siblings, she had children, many of whom had highly skilled trades and were very well known in the local community. And I am not familiar enough with Charlottesville to know what official historical markers exist for the whole family. But I do know now at Monticello there's extended interpretation of enslaved people's lives at the site. So it would be worth visiting and taking one of their specific tours to understand a little bit better enslaved life at that particular site. Do you have anything? I know you live in Charlottesville, so I don't know if you have a specific answer for that.
Well, not just Monticello, but the university in particular has been dedicating more time, resources, and attention to exploring the contributions of the enslaved laborers who worked here and helped to actually build and construct the university. And that of course included enslaved men, but increasingly included enslaved women as well. And there is a beautiful memorial to the enslaved laborers just to the right of the rotunda, and I think it is a stunning testament to the real labor and the work and the incredible contributions of the enslaved and Black community, not just to Charlottesville, but to the university in general. And so yeah, it now is, I think, a really good time to continue to ask these questions, because there are kind of visible memorials both on grounds and at Monticello that recognizes these really important contributions that are just now starting to be publicly recognized.
Other questions? Oh, there's one here and one in the back. Do you want to come a little closer? I think you come a little closer just because there's a microphone. Right, I don't know how far you.
Do you have an idea why the slavery happens today, modern day slavery, trafficking, and you think that's part of the capitalism?
Sure. That is, I think, a really important question, and I think one of the important aspects to recognize about the history of slavery is that slavery exists on a spectrum of coerced labor. And so, yes, there are modern forms of what we would call slavery under kind of a broader umbrella of what coerced labor looks like. And studying, I think, the history of American slavery in the U.S., for example, can give us, I think, just a broader understanding of how that coercion works and functions, and how, at least historically in this country, it has been connected to ideas of economic enterprise and profit.
You think the capitalism in the Silicon Valley comes to the play?
Oh, in Silicon. That I don't know. I mean, that is outside of my expertise. I'm not sure in terms of Silicon Valley.
So one thing I will say though is that and you point this out in your work, that the system of American capitalism develops in tandem with an expansion of American slavery. And so exploitation goes hand in hand with capitalist models. That exploitation exists on a whole spectrum of types of exploitation, who is doing the exploiting, at what level in the organization. And I do think that's something that can sometimes be obscured with the way that we procure goods in the present, is the actual labor that goes into producing those goods and the number of sites of labor that have to be involved. Something that I think came to light for all of us in the pandemic when that tanker got stuck in the Suez Canal was just how connected we are to the world. Still haven't figured out what exactly was on that boat. I feel like we'll experience a shortage at some point and realize what really was stuck there. Right? But the sort of brought a level of consciousness to broader markets, right? The ways that we really are connected, that these forms of labor and sites of labor really aren't so distant from touching our lives. So while I also will defer to people who are experts on the supply chains in these various industries, it's almost impossible that there's no exploitation somewhere in the chain. That certainly falls into the category of unfree labor.
I think that transparency is good in the profit that's made wherever it's made. Also, the influence of a ganging, in that surveillance aspect, and anti-capitalism might be a route for freedom.
Professor Edwards, your work sounds fascinating and very important. I guess, so you talked about and I guess in South Carolina, the individuals enslaved that participated in the economy. I'm not going to describe this as well as you would. How you were examining whether they were able to leverage their freedom as a result of their participation. There's freedom, right, and then there's agency along the way. Could you talk a little bit about the examples of people that enslaved that you researched, and how they were able to, if they were, did they earn profit? Did they try and turn profit into enhanced agency even though they couldn't fully get freedom? Just anything you can characterize along those lines. Thank you. Oh, and also, were they able to enhance their profit, whatever that would mean at the time, in their pursuit of greater agency over time?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. Yes, I mean, I found so many instances of enslaved men and women transforming their independent economic activities, which is what I call them, into, let's say, greater autonomy. And so perhaps they could control more what they did in their free time. They had a fair bit of, let's say, power to purchase and buy goods that they wanted or needed. I think one of the biggest and most visible examples of this were the ways in which enslaved men and women actually traded and bartered and sold goods and purchased goods from their enslavers. And their enslavers were actually keeping an accounting of these types of trades. And so that told me that the enslaved men and women who were engaged in these types of activities, who were raising livestock, who were raising chickens and selling eggs to their enslavers, who would bake goods and sell these baked goods to their enslavers, were in some way trying to eke out a bit of leverage, especially in their relationships with those who enslaved them. And so I found that incredibly fascinating. One, because it showed me that what historians had been talking about in terms of these types of activities being kind of a black market or being an underground economy was not the case at all. In fact, these types of economic actions were visible, they were public, they were documented, and in some ways they were not seen as being threatening to the stability of the culture of slavery. And so I think that was fascinating. But ultimately, even though enslaved men and women who were engaged in these types of activities could buy goods, buy liquor, buy sugar, buy clothing, buy hats, in some ways their kind of investment in time, their investment in wages actually did not bring them closer to freedom. In some ways, I conclude that it actually kept them tied and tethered to a system that profited off of their exploitation. And that was the kind of changing framework that I'm working with in the book, is seeing that, yes, having the ability to buy goods is one thing, but considering the environment in which one is able to cultivate those types of activities is quite another. And I think that's where this broader interrogation of the ways in which these activities fit into the rising system of capitalism kind of fit in really interestingly.
Any more questions from anyone? If not, I think we're coming up on time, so I may just thank you both. Oh, thanks.
Thank you both so much for your work and for your contributions and for the conversation today. Thank you all for coming, and hope you can buy some books, and maybe you all will be willing to sign them if so. So thank you all.
Thank you for your work, very much. I saw you.
Maybe the live stream.
Remember your thing before Holden is like, you know, you spoke at Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, summer Thomas Jefferson, a couple of years ago, and we're great in that too.
Thank you. I'm actually speaking right now.
Oh, all right. Okay, great. Yeah.
He has like a whole suggested.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, I'm sure that.